Have you ever elbowed anyone out of the way, whether it's physically or metaphorically, in order to win something? Do you think that the only way to get ahead is to compete?
Okay, so great questions. And I think we've said this before, Sarah, but when we have repeat guests back on the pod, it's because we love them, their work, and the message that they're not only sending out into the world, but also embodying themselves. And I think all of this can be said a million times over for today's guest and her brand new book, which is out today if you're listening to this when this episode drops.
Totally. And the conversation you're about to listen to was chock full of mic drop moments that turned our understanding of competition upside down. But also in this conversation were really deep moments when I feel like we really felt the power of this notion of uncompeting. So I'm curious, what was one of those moments for you, Misasha?
It is really hard to pick one. I will say that I loved the idea of giving other people flowers when you succeed, right? Your village, and you'll hear her talk about a very specific example in which she does this, which stood out for me and which I can't stop thinking about because it is such a powerful way of showing that, not only do we rise by lifting others, but there are so many people involved in our individual success, and how we can show up for others and how others show up for us is so, so important when we think about uncompeting, right? Sarah, what about you?
I knew you were going to ask me back. I also had this flash of thought, is this like the Miley Cyrus song? Is it Flowers? I don't know the name of it, but I can buy myself flowers.
I'm sorry. Are you asking me for a Miley Cyrus song reference? You have come to the wrong person, my friend. Unless it is Party in the USA. I do know that song. Okay.
I forgot you're a California hip hop chick. Okay. You're right. I had a feeling you were going to say women in community. So I was pushing myself to think just now about I guess two things. I mean, you'll hear my reflections on the power of this book and how, I really believe in it deeply and have lived it for a few years. And so I'm thrilled that it's out there. And I joked, I wish I had written this book, but there's no way I could have written this book. And she was the right person to write this book. And I'm thrilled that we get to magnify it and get it into as many hands as possible. So that's one thing. But the other part I felt was this almost, I can't remember if it was a sentence, but it was this idea that joy is our birthright. And I remember reading that section and feeling like a weight lifted from my shoulders. I physiologically felt this idea of damn, what if really we're all allowed to experience joy? What would that be like, especially for the women in our communities who I feel like often get the joy squashed out of us because we're busy keeping things going. And so I felt that on a visceral level and hope that more people think about what that means and if they feel that joy is their birthright and how can that show up in all of our lives, a little bit more regularly. But I will say, you and I could probably talk about this conversation all day long because I love it so much. But we do want you, our listeners, to hear it. So without further ado, we bring you our conversation with Ruchika Malholtra about her new book, Uncompete, and why we should all be redefining success together. You're listening to What Do You Mean By That? And we are your co-hosts, Sarah and Misasha.
Would you please introduce yourself for our audience?
Yes, thank you. I'm Ruchika Malholtra. I'm the author of Uncompete, Rejecting Competition to Unlock Success. And I have met these wonderful ladies before when we talked about my last book, Inclusion on Purpose.
Okay, so many places to go with this, but let's just talk about the book title to start. I love when you say this is a made-up word, right? You put that right in the start of the book, but this is a very necessary concept, right? That of uncompete. So tell us a little bit about that title, but also how you came to write this book in particular after your book, Inclusion on Purpose.
I feel like both of you and your audience will really appreciate this. I love that I made up this word for a number of reasons. And I think the number one of them, and this just tells us how much our childhood impacts us as grown-ups too, But I remember when I was in kindergarten, my mom took me to school in Singapore. And after a few months, the teacher basically said to my mom, like, I don't think this child is ever going to be able to speak English properly. So between that moment, getting a master's in journalism and then being
You're like, nailed it.
and then I remember when my lawyer came back and said, like, hey, we're pretty much done in terms of filing a patent on this word that you made up in the English language, is both very satisfying, but also a reminder of how, people's limiting beliefs, and especially as a kid, like the grown-ups around you that you trust and love, like the words they say about you can often stick with you. And for some people that can be, debilitating, and it can really, limit what they believe about themselves. And then there's some people like me that's like, I'm going to show you. So I'm excited to have this conversation with the two of you, because when I think about what it means to really show up and support each other at a time where there's just so much, and like there are polycrises happening at the same time, you really need to have people around you who believe in you and who you build together with. And I think that is at the core of Uncompete. So the idea is essentially that we reject competition, we reject zero sum, winner take all scarcity narratives in favor of really believing in abundance, in collaboration, in radical generosity, which I love to talk about, and I know we'll get to. And I think it's really putting out into the world what you believe and creating what you want to see, even and I don't want to be like glib about this, even at a time where it is absolutely, I would say, the hardest time, where these ideas are absolutely being, strength tested every day. Every time I turn on the news, like, you see the opposite of collaboration or empathy or generosity or inclusion. And it's still believing that, like, it's worthy to do that. And that our liberation lies in that. Now, the last question, just really quickly, about how I got from inclusion on purpose to Uncompete, is very much based on how much I would see, even in the heydays of when, y'all, had written Dear White Women, when we were talking very openly about equity and inclusion. I'm sure you can speak to this, I think, even more than me. You would, even in audiences that felt very receptive to, like, what does bias and equity and exclusion, what does that look like? Why are we, trying to be more equitable as a society and as a workplace? You would probably still hear or face like that little bit of like, I believe in this in theory, but in practice, are you trying to say, like, my kids can't get into a good college, or I'm going to lose my job because, my colleague who is a woman or a person of color or whatever it is has a higher shot of getting hired than me or advanced compared with me. And I think that zero sum, like, person A advances and person B has to be demoted, that sort of narrative was still very, very, very loud, even at a time where I felt like everyone wants to talk about DEI. So some part of Uncompete was seeded at this time in the heyday of DEI. And I think what we're seeing right now is literally that hesitation and those challenges, and that, like, refusal to accept why we need DEI. We see that, like, loudly. We see that opposition loudly. So
I love that. And I would love to just share a thought before Misasha dives into the questions. But this book is both a DEI piece, right? It supplements the progress that we could make with DEI. It could be a corporate piece, but I also think it's a very personal piece, especially for women. And to be honest, just to share a reflection, like, my personal gratitude that you wrote this book, because from the first moment I read your book, I mean, I texted Misasha, I was hooked. This book describes the process I actually have been living, having not been in corporate for years, but I have had to go through unlearning and relearning over the last 2 years. Competition, tuning into what my body needs, what my kids need, my family needs, my community needs. And I've had to completely reevaluate what I am doing with my time. And it's almost like as I level up into my 40s, I've basically said I give less Do we curse on our show? I can't quite remember. But the way I live in Colorado, people are more relational rather than transactional. At the World Happiness Summit, I've learned loads about me culture versus we culture. I declared in a Christmas card, a holiday card years ago, I shifted my definition of success away from how many emails I responded to the sense of inner peace. Like over and over and over again, as I was page after page, I'm like, oh, she's pulling from, Dr. Sue Varma. She's a friend of ours. She's pulling from, Ramani Dravasala. Like there's so many people and resources that you reference here that this is what I experienced. And I am so grateful you have packaged it so that more people can learn and get this message. And to me, it was this sign that maybe we're all onto something. Maybe the fact that I'm just a small little sliver in this universe, but I was doing this and now it's official with a whole new word attached to it. And this is transformative if more people and women read this and apply it to not keeping up with the Joneses, to their corporate job, to everything. So I'm grateful. That was a really long-winded way of just saying I am so impressed by and grateful for your work.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And can I just say that means so much more than I can say, because this time, in a world that is so data driven and give me examples, we're seeing examples of the opposite all the time, right? It's hard you have kids, I have kids, I have a kid. It's really hard to explain why people who are the opposite of what we're trying to do collectively are seeming to succeed and win at life. It's really hard for me to explain to my 9-year-old son, why someone who openly disparages other people and makes other people bullies other people can hold some of the highest offices in the world, right? And so when I hear no, you're not alone, it means more than I think it ever did in the past. And I want to say I don't at all, I have never been this way, but I especially with Uncompete want to say nothing in this should feel revolutionary in the sense that it should, I hope people say things okay, I never thought about it this way, or, oh, this helps me connect to something I've thought about in a different way or I've heard about in a different way. But I want to let people know this has this philosophy and this way of life has lived and been around for years, for decades, for centuries, right? Towards the end of the book, I draw from ancient Hindu wisdom, which is thousands of years old. I talk about Maria Montessori in terms of educational models. I talk about we have had acts of resistance and acts of generosity and abundance for centuries. And I don't want us to forget in this time where it really does feel like these crises are new. And yeah, some of them do feel like they're new, enabled by technology. But I don't want anyone to feel like we haven't had the answers within us all this time. And the last thing is, if there's a word that can help capture that, whether it's uncompete, whether it's some of the ways that we have been able to name, what does practical optimism mean? What does it mean to, what does it mean to name even things like narcissistic personality disorder, which when I read Dr. Ramani's work, I was like, oh my gosh, I think my life just changed because I was finally able to give a name to a lot of what I had faced in my childhood, with one of my parents being that. So all of this to say, I love that we're building this together. I really do believe in that from the bottom of my heart.
Okay, well, I feel like we could just end there, but I loved reading this book, and I promise we will ask you some actual questions and not just fangirl this whole time. But I spend time with my own kids, but I spend a lot of time in schools with kids, and they understand this and adults do not, or have lost that ability to understand that. So I love the way that you are able to connect the dots so clearly. And I want to take us through the book a little bit, right? But leave some for others or on their own. And I want to start with, you list kind of early on the 8 practices of Uncompete. And I was reaching for my book because I realized I need to read these to you. Reset our mindset, reframe comparison, choose joy, create an abundant community, build collective power, liberate our bodies, redefine success on our own terms, and seek peace. And these are great. And I'm wondering at the same time, right? These are hard to do, especially hard, I think, depending on who you are and what you've been taught along the way and how long you've spent in the corporate world and so many different things, right? So I'd love to ask you, which one of these was the hardest for you to achieve?
Oh, redefine success for sure. To be fair, both liberate our bodies and redefine success. I think it's very, again, like, I feel very safe having this conversation in this community and especially with the two of you. But I am like whatever a double immigrant is, right? Like my parents were immigrants to Singapore. I grew up my whole life being sort of like a third culture kid and child of immigrants. And then I moved to the United States as an immigrant, and now I'm raising like a son. So there's like all these layers of immigrant and like inherent value placed and literally like you are told in no uncertain terms that your only value and worthiness to live and belong in the country that you live in and the home you live in and the school you go to, all of that is only to do with how much you produce and how much you succeed in terms of a very, very narrow definition of success, And I think I'm going to get the number wrong, but I've been looking at like statistics and numbers to show how few people of like Asian and especially South Asian descent get into like the arts and especially in Hollywood, right? Despite having such a thriving Bollywood culture where I grew up from, which is, again, there's also a lot of like nepotism and only rich people can really get into the industry. And like, there's all these layers. But the point is, you're shown a very narrow definition of what success means. So to actually actively reject that and say, like, it's more than okay. I'm so happy for my friend A, who's, going to become like a partner at their law firm. And I'm so happy for my friend B, who is off to, like is like doing, getting a PhD or whatever it is. And I'm more than okay to sit down and say, like, these are not goals I want for my life. And this is not how I define success. And I think that's very, very hard. And I don't always get it right. And I think in not being able to sit down and define success for yourself, we often give in to competitive norms, to comparison, to envy, to even sabotage and like sort of like disparaging others instead of being like, hey, I'm really excited for my friend who defines success as like being able to make partner, or I'm really excited for my friend who has their own definition of success, but that doesn't have to be my definition of success. Because when you actually peel back the layers, you realize like that was never my real definition of success. I just kind of got conditioned because of who I was around and my family and other people and what society placed on me, as a person of color as well. So there's that. And I think very intimately tied to that is like your body doesn't belong to to yourself, especially if you're a woman, right? From the day one. And I see this because I'm raising a boy who like honestly like couldn't care less if like he, like has no idea and really doesn't care like what people think of what he looks like or how he's dressed or whatever it is. And how much for my friends who have been conditioned as girls who are or raising girls are really struggling with this, like how our body doesn't belong to us. And so the ability to like take up space, to rest when we need, to really be liberated in like feeling embodiment. I'm like enraged by the research that's showing like how for decades we are running women into the ground because we don't lean into the research around how important strength training is for your body as you get older. But how many, I think of my own mom, right? Like for decades, it was like, oh no, women like shouldn't be lifting weights. You should be dainty and narrow, and never mind like how many more health issues you get as a result of that. So all of this to say like this idea that you get to like choose what to do with your body and when and how to rest and how to liberate it. I mean, that feels very radical and very, very hard for someone like me.
I echo and understand both viscerally and then intellectually what you're speaking of. And I have a question around that. In particular on the redefining success, I'm actually co-writing a book on raising kids and teenagers who are different. Chapter 1 is redefining success and how do we reclaim what society has often taught us. And in particular, when we're looking at living in the United States, where it's very capitalistic, very individualistic, not many social safety nets. is the idea of uncompeting to some degree a financially privileged thing for us? Like, how do we process that? Because even in my journey the last 2 years and redefining what I need to do, I'm very grateful that I have the financial resources to do this. I have a partnership that has allowed me safety to grapple with these things. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Like, how do we understand this in the greater societal context?
I love this. And this is so nuanced. So, one of the amazing women I interviewed for the book, and eventually I think we didn't keep her interview in, but Angela Saini, who is an amazing writer, has written 3 books. And, she's a science writer. And she, especially one of, I mean, all her books are amazing, but the one that I really resonated the most with is called Inferior. And it's about the pseudoscience that, like, has proliferated the idea that, like, women are inferior and therefore not, like, technologically, created technologically to succeed in industries like technology, et cetera, right? Like, biologically, we're different, which, again, her book kind of counters all the science. She came to mind specifically because when I was interviewing her for this book, she said, like, I just want to remind you that, like, it's really hard for people who have experienced scarcity, like experience what it's like to be really shut out by the margins, like, because they live in the margins of society. It's really hard to expect them to uncompete. Like, it's like, I just want to tell you, like, this is, I've thought of this often. I remember others bringing up examples of how, like, I'm sure, again, something I'm sure we can all relate to, like, we'll go into these, corporate offices, will have a conversation about gender inequality. The women who are in these elite positions will agree. And yes, there's a gender pay gap, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody's thinking about, like, the women of color who are coming to clean the offices afterwards. Nobody's thinking about the women of color who are, cleaning homes and, like, doing these really, really dangerous low wage jobs. And how do we tell people like that to uncompete? How do you do that? And I agree that there's so much nuance here. So the way I've thought about this is in 2 kind of facets. Number one is you'll find that very largely, even people who have a lot of financial privilege and abundance still often fall into the trap of, like, I got to compete. I got to keep everything really scarce. Like, if my company makes $100, I gotta undercut the people I hire and make sure that they only get paid $1 so I can keep 99, that sort of mindset. So I hope this provokes a lot more of us, like, including myself, to ask, like, do we need to compete in every situation? Do we need to operate from that scarcity thinking all the time? And where does it show up in our lives, right? And where is there opportunity to choose different, right? Like, where is there opportunity to invest or be radically generous, even, without kind of conforming to that, like, we got to always be comparing and competing and saving and scrimping, and, like, there's that. The other side is what I found, and I think research backs this up, and I've definitely faced this in my own life. Some of the most generous and most community focused people in the world are the ones that have the least and have really relied on a lot of these principles of uncompete very much naturally, and very much in terms of building community and building solidarity, because they've always been left out of like the structures that have created financial privilege for others. So I would say I get a lot more inspiration from there anyway. And I have seen, the way that women, especially women of color, who are on the sort of intersections of, like, of being poor or being, financially insecure, showing up in ways that are really generous, that I think a lot of us who aren't in those situations can learn so much from. I certainly have personally. So there is nuance, and I don't want to like undercut the fact that there is nuance to this.
No, I appreciate that, because I think that's right. Like, I think that makes so much sense to allow that there is nuance, that there is difference, that we can learn from one another all the time. Before we move on to this next section, I do want to ask about one of the pillars, which was joy, because Sasha and I have talked about this a lot on my thoughts of joy. I tried to start a fun, like, women's play dates this year. Like, let's have more fun. I feel like when I totally casually do a survey, when the men get together with guys and they go play basketball, they go do whatever, they have joy. They go play, they don't talk, they just experience things together. oftentimes when I speak to women about what brings them happiness, we are having coffees, lunches, dinners, solving our problems and the world's problems by talking to one another. And that brings meaning, but it doesn't feel to me the same as joy. And there was something there that I wanted to, like, there's the undertone of that is this struggle for self-worth. Are we worth taking the time to have joy? Can we just discuss the concept of joy a little bit?
I'm making my way through Having It All, which is a great book by Dr. Corinne Lau. I think that's how she says her last name, could be Low, who has written, a Wharton professor who has looked at the data of like this idea of like women having it all. And the fact is like, we don't, right? We're responsible for so much more home care and child care and keeping things running. I mean, we don't even have to like go into like the mental load piece of it and how much that impacts our ability to show up in the workplace indeed and be recognized and all of that, but also like the emotional like toll it takes on you to be responsible for all of that. So I would say for me as a systems thinker, I've always thought about it like as a systemic issue that women are struggling to feel or make time for leisure, make time for like just being in your body, for playing, for things like that. We don't have the luxury because the systems haven't been set up to support us in having that. And I think what is interesting is it is a radical act of resistance if you can lean into and find joy that is truly your own. That's why in the book, like, I really try and move away from what Dr. Pooja Lakshman, who's become a good friend, calls like faux self-care, where you're just kind of like, oh, I've done a bubble bath and now I'm fine. Or I went for a massage and like that has fixed the deep burnout and stress I feel as a mother, as a caregiver, as a woman in the workplace facing all these biases, and finding like real self-care, like dealing with some of those chronic challenges that we face in our society. And so for me, I think being able to find joy, that's why in the book, when I was writing about this topic, I was very careful not to say like, oh, like these are like the very quick and easy practices that I do that benefit my community. I mean, yes, being in a group, being in a conversation like this, being around other women, yes, there is some level of joy, but there's also a lot of, as you mentioned, Sarah, solving problems and talking about how to make the world a better place and how do we show up for each other? How do we show up for other women? Whereas what I write about in the book, like how I start that chapter on choosing joy is like biting into a full juicy peach in the middle of summer is joy. Like nobody else benefits. Even my kid isn't benefiting in that moment. I'm not being a better mother. I'm not being a better worker. I'm not being a better like human being. I'm just literally leaning into a moment of like pure pleasure. And there's something about more of us as women being able to do that I think again will help us reset and show up in a way that we really want to against these real systems that are against us.
Ooh, I love that. And I love the nuances that we're able to discuss in this conversation as well, because those words seem so simple and yet the concept is so difficult and challenging. I want to take us back to a little bit earlier in this conversation where you were talking about, the work that we have all done in corporations, right? Or going into places and talking to people about DEI or talking to people about the concept of, like we can do better. There are ways to be better at this. And at the same time, people's reactions based on the concept that this is a zero-sum game, right? Like if some other group gets more power, then that automatically takes power away from the people who are holding it. And I'm going to put a pin in power for a second because I want to talk about that a little bit later. But can you talk to us a little bit? Because when you wrote this in your book, I was like, yes, about zero-sum thinking and how that has held DEI practices back for basically forever, right? Because I think we're seeing this at its sort of extreme or caricature almost even now as we are dealing with so many things out there in the world in 2025, right? But I would love to get your thoughts about this and really how we should think about this instead.
Yeah. I mean, the zero-sum thinking that I saw even in moments and with leaders and with people who care about DEI as a sort of thought experiment, a theory, sort of like, I believe everyone's equal. still shows up in such pernicious ways when you really boil it down. And part of that is like, what does it mean for me if a group that doesn't look like me is getting ahead, right? And it's really hard to wrap our heads around the idea that like a rising tide lifts all boats. The number of times I was sort of asked to come in and talk about or provide research on how DEI is actually great for dominant group folks, for men, for white people. Like, how does it make us more productive? How does it make us smarter? How does it make us more innovative? Can you use all the data to show that rather than like, hey, this is purely the human rights, like, right thing to do? And until you don't deeply in your soul understand that and can get behind that, then like this is just a thought exercise. And that's why, like, and the interesting thing is the data, at least in terms of correlation, if not causation, is so clear when you look at how much more these companies that are supposedly all about profit and all about innovation, how they're willing to, in many ways, ignore that and leave money on the table because what gets in the way is this sort of zero sum thinking, right? If group A gets ahead, my group's going to be left behind. And so I really think that that to me has shown up as the biggest blocker, right? Yes, there's prejudice and racism that underscores it, but the real sort of big blocker is this idea that that our groups must be pitted against each other, that there has to be a hierarchy. And again, if you look at so many cultures, if you look at indigenous cultures, which of course have been, colonized and lost, and so many beautiful traditions have been lost, you realize like in so many parts of the world, that hierarchy doesn't exist in quite the same way. It doesn't have to be like if group A wins, the group B loses. And so I think for us to make meaningful progress in DEI, whenever the pendulum swings back, which I know it will, we'll lose a lot in the meantime, but the pendulum will swing back. I think the big question is like, how can we reframe and reset our minds to stop thinking about this as a zero-sum game and really as like, no, like it's the right thing to do, and a rising tide lifts all boats. Like, why would you want to be part of a society or a workplace where half the population is being oppressed and, and dealing with so much of difficulty on a daily basis?
I wrote down in that section, it's that the pie increases. Like we think the pie stays the same and it's this way, but like we're forgetting that there's so much growth potential when you actually allow yourself to think differently.
And I heard this from, speaker and, expert Felicia Hatcher on an Instagram reel, but I will say that is sometimes where I get news as well from, or at least information. And so Felicia Hatcher talked about how, like, rather than think about things as a pie, can we think about it as a garden, right? Like you plant the seeds and you continue watering it so that for generations, people have an opportunity to eat rather than just splitting one pie into many different pieces and then the pie is gone. And I think so much of what I'm trying to do with Uncompete is like, how do we create something for the long term, not the short term? And I'll give you an example. So in this book process, it's always really it's one of those very strange processes where you really feel like there is a scarcity, right? Like when people, when you're trying to get a book out into the world, yes, there's like a release date. That pub date is everything. Like on that date, you got to have like all these talks and things lined up. If on that day you don't have a talk lined up, then oh my gosh, your book is going to flop. Or the first week matters the most because that's when like all these lists and bestsellers and all of that, that's when it's going to come out. So if that week's gone, that's it, you're done for. Like your book is never going to become a bestseller. And then all this media sort of attention where you're again told like, if your book released this week, maybe we'll interview you. Otherwise you're done. And so you're already kind of fed into the system with scarcity. What happens is, again, this is a very unusual experience for those of us, those of us may know, like with product launches or with other things. I think with books, it's also similar. You're told there's a very small, scarce window. So even someone like me who has written this book about uncompeting, of course I feel that scarcity, right? And of course I feel that heightened sensitivity. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this person who I've done so much for in the world, like they didn't even come to my book launch, or they didn't even support my book, or they didn't even post about it. Blah, blah, blah. Like it's very easy to go into like all the ways you didn't get supported. And I think a competitive, hierarchical, zero-sum structure is like, I did something for A, so they need to come back and do it directly for me, right? And it's very short term thinking. It's very transaction based. And speaking of being relational and relationship based, what I've started to do and what I've really tried to do this time around differently from past book launches and past big product launches I've done, even in my corporate life, is really focus on like, am I creating for the long term something that will hopefully yield results where for years on end, people will say like, hey, I'm glad Ruchika like was, generous to me. I'm going to pay it forward to other people. It doesn't have to be they turn right back around and they're like, oh, like you did this, so I'm going to do this. Like I'm keeping score. And again, that's really hard. This is really hard to do in a world that tells us we got to be keeping score all the time. And so it's really hard to take your own medicine sometimes. And I'm trying damn hard, is what I'm trying to say here.
I appreciate like how open you are because I think it is very true, right? I think Sarah and I, we felt this with our book. Like we feel this to this day, I think around different pressures. And so I think it's really important to be able to name this, right? So that we can also think about how we build together past or, into a different structure. Um, and and I want to kind of tie that or talk a little bit about since we're talking about sort of systems or bigger, concepts like that of power, right? Because you had a great discussion in the book on sort of contextualizing power. And basically at the same time I was reading your book, I was also reading this article about immigrant like children of immigrants and basically how quickly you get like sort of told, sucked into capitalism. And like, because that is the goal, right? That's the goal that's been set out for you by your parents who have worked hard to get you, kind of create this foot in the door for you, their children, right? And, I say this as a lawyer, right, who has a brother who is a doctor, right? So my parents kind of hit their like Japanese immigrant dream early on. What is the role of capitalism in this? How does power show up? Like, and how do we redefine it? And then like, how do we get there, right? How do we do that work to get there?
I have to say, power is really tough because I think a lot of the models of power we've seen in society are the power over, not the power with and power together with format. And I think it can be really hard to choose something different. And what you'll start to see is when we are able to change that, it has to be done collectively. And I think some of the most powerful examples of that, speaking of power, are like, I think we're starting to see a lot more younger and very, very optimistic and very, very successful front runners. For example, like the politics, the elections are on my mind right now because my book launches on general elections day, which will be interesting. Like everyone will be focusing on that, not the book, which I am totally fine with. But I'll be in New York City when people say like Zoran Mamdani has a very high chance of becoming the next mayor. I remember Sadiq Khan was running in London, for a while when I was there. And then, here in Seattle, where I'm based, we also have a very hotly contested mayoral race where like sort of a young policy wonk, sort of like an outsider in many ways. Katie Wilson is running against, again, a very quote unquote powerful with a big, capital P, front runner, or like incumbent, not front runner. What I think is going to be really interesting is we're already starting to see like what it means when you build something from the ground up, from the grassroots, when you say like, we are not going to give in to these really power over, bullying over, exploit over sorts of definitions of power. And we're really trying to build collective power with, one person at a time together, no one left behind. And I think we're starting to see that. I think, again, it's easy to lose hope because, yes, indeed, on a larger scale, we are seeing it in quite the same way. But that's where, like, we have so much capability for imagination, and we have to imagine a future where people can really build power collectively and not just over others.
I loved the book, The Power Code, and it talked about this idea of the power over and just to make sure, like, I think a lot of women in particular may have been turned off this notion of gaining power because traditionally it's always been you have power over people. But the more you realize that if you build influence and you build it together, you have the power then to do something for the greater good, it completely shifts the energy around why you might want to build your business or why you might want to hold that dinner party. You gain this power to have influence in a good way and not control people. It really like it flips that, like, as you said, from the ground up. And I had wondered a little bit about whether that relates to individualism versus collective. Like when you said it to build something new, it made me think about the Japanese idea. It's a very collective society. And, there's rules. Like if you, for example, die by suicide by jumping in front of a train, and this took a real dark turn real quick, sorry. But like if you do that, they will find out who you are and your family is held responsible for the cleanup fees. Like you are part of a greater whole for better or for worse. Or like in the government registries, there's family lines. And when you marry, you move physically from one to another. Like it's a very tracked system, but it's built in the collective. And I don't know that it necessarily relates to power, but I guess it just means we have the ability to frame our culture. And if we want to have the power to culture, we can start that at our dinner tables, in our offices, in our small groups, in our friendships. We can really think differently about it. And I guess that ties into my question about something we discussed really briefly, the idea of radical generosity, because we have the power to choose that, right? And like you said, we're faced with examples of the opposite all the time. And I remember reading that part of it and saying it really reminds me of the power of kindness and all of the science that talks about when we choose not to be nice to people please, but to choose kindness, something for the greater good. It does our bodies good, it does society good. And we've discussed this before. So can you talk a little bit about radical generosity and sort of how that shows up maybe for you, your life, your work, how it can show up for others?
Yeah. Sarah, thank you for saying that. I do want to kind of peel back a little bit when we talk about power. I want to use a personal example. So the last 12 months have been really hard for anyone who has been part of the DEI profession overall, right? Who has done the work that, I think we all do, but in our different ways. And the more sort of you were known for that, probably the harder the hit you took. If you diversified, good for you. And I had an 80% drop in business inquiries in the last year. And I've talked about this publicly. It was hard. It took a lot of like unlearning ideas of success because of course I felt like a failure. And one of the things that really kind of made me feel optimistic, even in such a hard time, like again, financially, personally, huge amounts of like self-worth, self-esteem questions, all of that as I worked through all of those with, good therapist, etc. But another part of it was also asking myself, like, where I had power and were there any other professional wins that, like, perhaps, again, wouldn't show up in my balance sheet or wouldn't show up in, like, an award or, like, people being like, oh, Ruchika's so great. And I think one of the most powerful moments for me last year, and a moment where I felt, like, still powerful despite, like, sort of the drop in whatever income, was I was able to, a dear friend of mine whom I thought really deserved, a powerful job in the city I live in. She was in her final round interviews. We weren't sure like what would happen. And I sent a note to the people who on the hiring committee, and I just said, I was like, I think she's going to be amazing for this. And I would love it if you would reconsider and have a look at sort of all your candidates. Please know like this person will really do an amazing job and would give her whole heart to it. And a few months later, she got the job, and it felt really exciting to have such an influential role be given to someone who I knew would like excel in it. And it's been a year. And of course, this person has excelled and been amazing and powerful in every way. And I think sometimes what we think about power is this idea like power means like we become all powerful and all knowing and we oppress others. But can we think of examples in our lives where power has actually been with others and for greater good and allowing other people to step into their influence and power? And so not the same as sort of the Japanese example you were citing, but I think this idea like we're responsible for each other too, and building power does come with that responsibility of like, how does it impact other people? And then making good choices as a result. I think is very much at the core of like what this means. And so, kind of switching that to radical generosity, again, it's one of those examples of like, I went with what I thought was right, and I'm glad that I was able to use a little bit of the influence and power I have to have someone who really is deserving. And we know a lot of times women, especially women of color, get overlooked all the time for jobs they're eminently overqualified for. But I think some part of it also, what motivated me is like, I was like, what kind of world do I want to build, right? If there's an influential role in the city I live in, someone who gets a big outsized say in how things are done, wouldn't I love to have someone there? Wouldn't I love to use some of my power and influence to make sure that person also operates with similar, collective, like power with generous ideals? And so part of, I think, radical generosity is like, how do you pay it forward without expecting that to come back to you right the way, like, it's not like a one-to-one. It's not like I gave you an apple, I expect an apple back, but more like, how do you plant seeds so that more people in the world can benefit, more people in your society and in your orbit can benefit? And I think that's hard. We don't always see it modeled. Most of the time we don't. So it's about actually going against that.
And I love the garden example that seems to come up multiple times through all of this. I think we are acculturized to be selfish and look for our own survival. But if we have the width, we can sometimes step back and be like, "Ooh, I can remember to write that review for that person. I can remember." Do you have a practice to remind yourself and hold yourself in that space of radical generosity?
Yeah. So again, going to be very nuanced. As you can see, my brain doesn't think like it very, I wish it did in like, here's a straight answer. But I think gratitude is really important. And I want to really underscore it with the big caveat that I really despise the way women have been sort of there's gratitude is weaponized against us to be like, oh, we should always be like toxically positive and always be grateful for anything that for the scraps that come our way. And that is not the type of gratitude I'm talking about. But I'm talking about like deep science-backed gratitude that's like, or the science behind why gratitude and having a gratitude practice is so important, and how it kind of both lifts your mood and helps you become more generous. Because what it does is it allows you to, again, see yourself as like as someone who is being looked after, someone who does have things to celebrate and does have parts of their lives to feel good about and to feel grateful for, right? And for me, that has been a big part of figuring out, of having a gratitude practice allows me to be more sort of radically generous and pay it forward in a way that I think is meaningful.
So I'm going to ask about that gratitude practice too, because in your book, you talk about this party that you threw for 25 women in your life, personal and professional. And I mean, I love that, right? Just to celebrate what they've done for you, not around any event or occasion, but just, to say thank you. And this stood out to me as one of the examples in your book that where you talk about giving flowers to others when you succeed. And so I want to know all the things about this. Like, how did you come up with this? Like, how'd they react? And have you seen this grow, or have you done this again in your life, or has it shown up in different ways?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I recently reached out to everyone. So, I'm lucky where I've had interactions with all 25 women, and to different degrees, as the years have gone on. Some have continued to be really close friends. Some became much closer afterwards. Some, moved out of the city or whatever it is. So definitely that comes and goes. And I think that's also part of what I've been trying to say with the book, right? Like the last thing I want to do is, especially for women, to be told like you're not doing enough, you need to add another thing to your life, you need to do more, you need to smile more, you need to laugh more, like what all this horrible stuff we've been placing on women. But I think it's important to ask ourselves, like, what type of community can we invest in and what feels right given the moment we're in? And in 2023, I had a really financially successful year. I had a year where there was a lot of professional wins, from 22 to 23 was, 1 year since Inclusion on Purpose came out. And I was like, I don't want to lose sight. Like, I don't want to I don't want to lose sight of how much I'm living a dream that like even 5 years ago I could never have even imagined for myself. And so one of the ways that I feel like I'll really like be able to be present and enjoy this moment fully is if I can enjoy it and celebrate it with those who have cheered me on in one way or another. And, gathering these incredible women, and, we sat down, we were starting to eat. And I totally unexpectedly, one woman, Julie, stood up and she started saying, thank you to me. And then sort of it just kicked off this like chain reaction of people sharing how I had impacted their lives when actually I wanted to do the opposite. And that was not even what I expected. And I think we're hungry for that. I think we're hungry to be part of a community where we are celebrated and we're cheered on. And it hasn't been modeled, right? Like, and especially for women, if you think about it, it's you probably the times where that happens for you is if you're lucky, like if you get married, right? And, you don't face scrutiny and all of that. I certainly did. I had a very traditional Indian wedding. Definitely did not enjoy it. In fact, recently my 9-year-old was like, what was the food like? And I was like, I don't remember a single bite I ate for those. And I had a 3-day wedding. And then if, so there's that. And then maybe again, if you're lucky, like if you have had a child or children, and that's about it. Like for many of us, like as I wrote in the book, like my milestones were done by then, right? Like my traditional milestones were done. So we don't see it modeled as much. And I think it's like, what can we do that feels realistic and doable? It could be a Zoom call. It could be something else. It doesn't have to be this huge fancy thing, but how can we remember that like we are part of a greater collective and invest in that?
Oof. I'm going to think about that some more too, because
I'm in it. Like, this is the
I
stuff
mean,
I do.
what you two do here is really, it's profound because I think part of Uncompete is like, what does it look like to create like spaces for yourself and others like you in a world that tells you that like your voice and your point of view and you taking up space doesn't matter beyond very traditionally prescribed ideals of wife, mom, like maybe like a lawyer or this like fill in the blank career like option here, you know?
Totally. And it ties right back to the joy, the celebration. We're worth it. Like these layers of your book work so beautifully together to support and spiral upwards. I think this is great.
It means so much you saying that to me because obviously at this part, this is a very vulnerable time when your book is first out into the world where you're like, will people get it or will it seem like disjointed or too simplistic or like there's all these like it's really hard not to like second guess yourself, so thank you for saying that.
I want to read this quote from the end of the book because it is one of the things, and since like law school, I don't really like highlight or underline anything because like that just burned me out of all of that. But I noted this because it was so powerful. So here it is. Seeking peace as a goal to uncompete is radical and revolutionary. It requires us to not be passive bystanders, but active creators and leaders of our lives in community with others. For all of us who ever felt like there wasn't an answer to the restlessness and despair we've been feeling, we must know it was always inside us, ours to choose and unlock and unleash. When we uncompete, we find redemption. We create justice. We begin the healing we are so desperately seeking for ourselves and others. So that comes at the end of the book. But that to me was like this mic drop moment that so deeply spoke to me and what I needed to hear. And as to where we are right now and, all of these things, right? And what we need in 2025. So as we think about, because we could talk to you for hours and just have you, keep sharing these pearls of wisdom with us and with our listeners. What haven't we asked about Uncompete or about you and your work or anything that you want to share with our listeners?
Oh my gosh, thank you. What a difficult question you asked because we had such a beautiful conversation. I think for me, the only thing I will say is how are you finding like joy in this moment? Like I know it's difficult and I know we're in a I know we're again in a really tough time in history. I think we'll look back on these few years and it's going to be very tough for so many of us. So joy in many ways is an act of resistance and very radical. How are the two of you finding joy?
Well, I literally have a shirt that says joy is an act of resistance.
Good.
I have done so much better at building my well-being foundations and holding them as non-negotiable. And I know that's a foundation. It's not like the extra peak of joy, but I've been giving myself so much more space. I have morning coffee routine. I box every week to punch out my frustration. I still work out regularly. I talk to friends. I enjoy now, instead of hating TV time with my kids because I felt like it was a waste of time, we're enjoying time together, and so I have slowed. Rest as resistance piece is huge for me, and I have done everything I can this last year to really focus on adding joy and people and community.
Yeah, I love the slowing down, Sarah. I think that is a big part of how we're gonna be able to resist together, right? Slowing down, not adding more. So that's so beautiful. What about you, Ms. Asha?
I will say for me, I focus on being in community with others, sort of to the point of like, getting just being with people, right? I go to ballet, which is something that I did for years competitively. Well, I don't know, competitively. It's not like ice skating, but where it was very pressure filled and something I loved, but also, hated at the same time because it was so much. And to do it in your 40s with, women that range from sort of, I think we've now got some in their 30s, but, to their 80s, right, in this class is just, it's beautiful because we get to celebrate each other and we, grieve with each other when someone loses someone close to them. And we talk about all of our physical ailments in the way, but we just get to exist in that space and just, dance. And it is something that is really, really beautiful and is, to your point about the peach in the summer, right? This is something that is for me, right? It is not for my kids. It is not for, anything that I do professionally. It is just me and something I love. And then the other thing I will say that we do a lot more is being out in our own community. Like there was an art and wine fair this weekend, and we've been, trying to buy art from Black artists to make sure that that is reflected in our house. And the weekend prior, I was learning about a kindergarten readiness program in our community and hopefully getting the boys to volunteer for that. And the weekend before that, we were at a different sort of art festival. And so I think just to prioritizing that time where we are out in community and reminding, especially, my boys that this is who we are, right? This is what we can do together. And this is what it means to be around others and all of the friction that comes with that, but also all of the beauty that comes with that as well.
I love that. That is exactly what I think this moment in history demands of us. Like, how do we really show up in a way that is thoughtful and meaningful and building the reserves and building community for the long term? Because we need it. Boy, do we need it.
We sure do. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Everyone go out and get your copy of Uncompete. It is out today if you're listening on release day, November 4th, 2025. And thank you again for spending this time with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation. Beautiful.
You've been listening to What Do You Mean by That? A show dedicated to being better humans and getting loud for all of us. Hat tip to Sarah's daughter for the logo, and huge thanks to Misasha's son for our incredible theme music. Find out more and subscribe to our newsletter at whatdoyoumeanbythat.com. Because as always, it's all of us or it's none of us.